Hello and welcome to the Quint Hindi Quint and Bloomberg Quint. I have a very special guest today, Dr. Gita Gopinath, Chief Economist at International Monetary Fund. She has just released medium-term World Economic Outlook. As the COVID pandemic-led health and economic destruction continues, the World Bank forecasts world economy will contract by 4.4% and India's economy will contract by 10.3% before we see some kind of recovery. That's what we want to understand, that in what kind of situation we are in today. Dr. Gopinath, thank you for taking time for us. The first question to you would be, why do you think the ascent to recovery will be long, uneven, and uncertain? Are we in deep crisis?
So thank you, Sanjay. Long, because firstly, the health crisis is not over. So we are still living with the virus. We don't have an end to the pandemic. And as long as that's the case, people are going to practice social distancing. And we're going to see a longer time for recoveries in contact intensive sectors like, restaurants and hospitality, tourism. And so unless we are able to end that either through better ways of managing to live with the virus or through vaccines or treatments, it's going to take a long time. And it's also going to be an uneven ascent, because what we are seeing is we're seeing low-income workers, low-skilled workers getting much higher than high-skilled workers. We're seeing increases in abject poverty. Up to 90 million will be added to extreme poverty just this year. And also it's uneven across the world. You're seeing emerging and developing economies, excluding China, that are projected to suffer more during this pandemic than advanced economies. So everybody is in a bad shape. So the return back to 2019 levels for most countries will have to wait until 2022. In some countries, it'll have to wait until 2023. So this is why this is a very slow recovery.
Right. Do you think India's V-shaped recovery is real, or it is due to the pent-up demand, which is temporary?
So I would not describe most countries, including India's recovery, as being V-shaped. What we are seeing everywhere in the world is we saw a very bad collapse in the first half of this year. And then as countries have reopened, you have seen a partial rebound. So you've seen growth come back. So you see very large negative growth numbers, and then quarter on quarter, you see positive growth numbers. But we're not getting back to 2019 levels. That would be a V shape. So it's going to take a long time from now onwards going forward to get back to 2019 just levels. I mean, not just even in per capita terms. So it's not a V-shaped recovery. It's much more gradual than that. And that's true for many countries, with maybe the exception of China,
Right. So sense I get from IMF outlook is that India can come back to pre-2019 level only by 2022. But government here in India is sharing lots of data, high frequency data, to claim that we are kind of back on recovery track. And IMF says India's per capita GDP is going below, lower than Bangladesh this year. So how do we reconcile these two narratives?
What is correct is that there is a recovery that has started in India after the very deep collapse in the April to June months. I think the next release of data will tell you that it's much better than it was in April to June months. But again, we're starting from a low base, and it's what comes when you have reopenings. And so you will see a recovery. Now, the question is, when do you get back to 2019 levels? That, in our view, will take longer, well beyond, even beyond 2021.
Right. What does India need to do now? What more can the government and RBI do?
So the government has taken considerable steps. On the fiscal side, there's about 7% of GDP that's been deployed. That's really sizable. But if you look at the mix of measures that they have taken, it's been mostly measures that help with liquidity, so in the form of lending, lending support, helping with credit guarantees. and much less in the form of more direct spending, which has been more closer to around 2% of GDP, which is what we're seeing around the world is that these direct support measures, which put income into the hands of low-income households or into SMEs, seem to have a much bigger impact in terms of bringing back a faster recovery. So we think that there is space to do more on that front in terms of stimulus, the more direct stimulus, expanding it to both urban poor and rural and migrant workers, and also some of these policies, some of these schemes have expired or are going to expire, and I think there's scope to increase it. On the monetary policy side, again, many significant measures have been taken. We see scope for more monetary easing, especially after this inflationary spike comes down, some of which will be transitory because there's still very low levels of demand, overall demand. So there's more that can be done there. And the third is in terms of public investment. The government has announced very considerable packages on that front, and that's a very welcome step. That can also help with bringing about a faster recovery and also with creating jobs.
Right. I would like you to elaborate a bit more, because the IMF report says that the poor, the unemployed, and the stressed businesses, they need support, and they need support with speed. Is it justified to be so conservative when it comes to giving large fiscal stimulus? Would you recommend that India should really rethink its strategy?
So in line with what I just said, we believe there is scope for India to do some more, in terms of providing more direct support to low-income households and also to SMEs. Now, to be clear, I mean, of course, countries like India have more fiscal constraints than advanced economies do. So there is restrictions on how much you can spend. But that said, we believe there is scope to do some more.
Right. The IMF has said we will witness extreme poverty, inequality, and lasting damage to the people's living standards. How are governments responding to these challenges across the globe?
Yeah, these are very difficult trends that we are seeing everywhere in the world. Now, countries that have a lot of fiscal space, you are providing, very considerable income support. So, for instance, in the US, the lost income was more than compensated, which is why you've seen a faster recovery. But I think going forward, there will be several challenges. First, countries will have to plan for having a stronger social safety net, not just right now, but going forward, to ensure that you can reduce inequality. We're very worried about the lost education that we're seeing in many parts of the world, because distance learning is not exactly something that works in many places. And that is a real hit to human capital. That has to be remedied. And so these schemes, many of these schemes will be required for a longer time. And governments will have to find the resources in their budget to make it available on higher health spending, higher on education. I mean, all of this will be needed.
All right. What is the IMF's prescription for the world leaders? Are they collaborating enough? Because the IMF report details about the need of global coordination. Are they collaborating enough to fight the global economic crisis in this age of deglobalization and isolation?
They have several steps have been taken, if not in a coordinated manner, but at least in a synchronized manner. What we have seen is many governments in the world have deployed considerable fiscal and monetary policy support, and that because of that, that's helped the world. In March, for instance, there was the risk of having a big financial crisis, and that was mitigated because of the very large measures taken by central banks around the world. So that's been helpful. Multilateral institutions like the IMF have given a considerable amount of support to countries. We provided financing to 81 countries at record speeds, backed by our members. Now, that said, we see scope for much more that is needed. One is on the health front, which is that there needs to be greater collaboration to end the health crisis. The problem is less about science at this point, because we will very likely see vaccines and treatments and better testing, all of which can help end the pandemic. But the economics is not that great because we need to have sufficient production and distribution to all parts of the world to end this pandemic everywhere. And that requires much closer collaboration. Second, there are many countries who entered this crisis with high levels of debt. They don't have the finances to do the necessary spending on health spending, on protecting people's lives and livelihoods. And here again, international support is needed in terms of concessional financing, in terms of debt relief, and in some cases, just outright debt restructuring. So much more will be needed, and because this crisis is not over, and we are looking to the international community to do a lot more.
Yeah. So my two last questions before I ask my final question, one more question about US and other developing economies came with large economic relief packages. Do you still think there is space for them and that will help the other countries also, and it will actually help the entire world, or there is a limit to that also?
No, we would argue for them to do more, or at least to continue with the measures that they have in place. So one of our big messages is that countries with fiscal space should certainly not prematurely withdraw support. Additional packages in these economies, and they have the space to do it. They're able to borrow at very low to negative interest rates. That is good for their own countries, but also good for the global economy. And that is one of the messages that we are giving.
Right. So this is my last question, and I want you to be giving a detailed answer to this question, which is, how do you see the geopolitical situation currently and the trade tensions that we see between US and China, and it is going to affect the entire world. How is it going to play out after the US elections?
I mean, the tensions have been around before this crisis, and what we are seeing as of now, and this is even beyond, US and China, is you have an increasing number of trade restrictions and restrictions on investment that are happening everywhere in the world. So there is certainly a trend towards protectionism. Global trade is projected to collapse by over 10% this year. But you can explain a very large portion of that just by looking at the collapses that we're seeing in the individual economy. So it's not so much because of these trade restrictions or because of global supply chains. But that said, I am concerned going forward what's going to happen in terms of multilateralism, in terms of trade. There is a tendency towards nationalism in difficult times. And we are making a very loud case for that not to happen, because the world has benefited a lot from trade. If you want economies to recover faster, if you want their productivity to stay high, it is very important to keep the channels of trade open. Now, of course, it's not a perfect system, and it requires more steps to be taken to fix it in terms of designing the trade rules for the more modern economy, which is much more services trade, which has much more services trade than in the past, how to deal with subsidies and so on. So there are reforms that are needed, but it has to continue to be a multilateral system, and that's rules-based. And to your questions about the elections, I have no specific comment on that. I mean, we should see what happens after November 3rd.
Right. How realistic is the hope that all the big global leaders will actually sit together, forget about their personal agenda, and talk about saving the world?
Many leaders are sitting together and having many discussions. I mean, I'm privy to many of these discussions that are happening. You're seeing that central bank governors around the world are having regular meetings. Ministries of finance are having these meetings, and we're making progress. There has been rollback of some of the, for instance, at the beginning of the crisis, there were export restrictions that we put on medical exports. Many countries have rolled that back. That we've been able to provide financing to countries. So there's progress happening, but it will take more to get out of this one of the worst crises of our lifetimes.
Right. Wonderful, Dr. Gita Gopinath, for your observations. And as we discussed just before the interview, next interview with you shall be in Hindi. Thank you for your time.
Bilkul.
Thank you.